I recently converted a couple of arcade 1-up cabinets to use the 60-in-1, and I thought I'd put together a video showing all the components that I used and how I did it. So I've used some shrink wrap, some cable clamps. Another thing I did was added some D-sub connectors to the wires going from the control panel to the cab, and that way if I need to change something on the control panel, I can unplug it and work on it at the workbench rather than bringing the workbench to the cabinet. You can see the pinout here on the JAMMA harness. The player 1 is on the component side and the player 2 is on the solder side. And the little trick about soldering these pins, it's actually pretty simple. But before I get into that, the first thing I did was sort out the wires. So I have player 1 wires, player 2 wires, and the other wires. The trick to soldering these D-sub connectors is to tin the wire and also tin the connector. And then start with the wire or the pin furthest away from you and solder that one, and then come back and also don't forget to put on the shrink wrap so that when you're done you can shrink wrap all of the pins and wire to keep them isolated from one another. You'll notice here that I've got the plug, the male and the female plugged together, and that also acts as a heat sink while you're soldering. So by doing the soldering, tinning, and then a quick touch of the soldering iron, a hot soldering iron on the wire and the pin at the same time results in a quick soldered connection. And of course, once you get all the pins soldered, then you can install all the shrink wrap and shrink it down. Now you'll notice here that I have 2 wires on this side that I didn't use, but I did go back and add speaker wires. And on the other side, there are 3 wires or 3 pins that I did not use. And so they can be used for other things, like maybe adding low voltage power to lighted buttons with LEDs and such. Here you can see that the monitor, because I had issues with the 1-up monitor, I went ahead and stuck in a different monitor. And of course I liked the look of that, but I didn't like the border around it, so I decided to cut a new bezel and monitor mount, which is basically all in one. And here you can see it on the CNC machine being cut, and here's the face of it after it was finished cutting. And here I've sanded it and it's ready to be mounted. And so in mounting it, the monitor sets in the opening, and of course I've cut away a lot of the wood right next to the monitor, and that keeps it from holding heat. So I shouldn't be having any heat issues inside the cabinet. And here's a look at the new bezel monitor mount mounted in the cabinet. And then here we're looking at the other side of it, and this is the same piece of wood, but only has a piece of plexiglass over it. And of course there you can see a Pac-Man bezel that I thought about using, and then I decided to use a Donkey Kong bezel. So that's just something I printed off the internet. I like that result of that monitor mount and bezel so well, I decided I would cut a second one out of the other half of the board that I had left. And this one of course is going to be for a different monitor. It's about the same size viewing area, but the actual size of the monitor is a little bit smaller. So in that being the case, I needed to make this one adjustable. So I went ahead and cut it as before. And then I drilled some holes with a drill bit and tapped them, and I also used nylon bolts. I cut down the head of the nylon bolt so that they could fit without causing an issue. So you can see here I've drilled a hole, I've tapped it, and now I'm putting the bolt in, and you can see if that large head was on there it could be a problem, but in this case it lets the bolt go straight in. And then I simply back the bolt out to where the monitor is centered in the opening and fits snugly so it's not moving around. Once I do that, then I add a couple of pieces on the side, one on each side, and that secures the monitor in place. And you can see those pieces here in this image. They're the black pieces on either side. I needed to make sure the 5-volt was adjusted to 5 volts. So you can see here the power supply is mounted on standoff so it can breathe. Here you can see the wiring of the control panel and that bunch of wires. And now I've decided to add a coin door. So here I've started taking the front panel and replacing it with a piece of 1/2-inch plywood. And also I glued the original stock upper brace in the front panel. I actually epoxied that to the plywood and cut a notch in the plywood so that it could fit where the other piece was. And now we're going to be listening to and watching this final cut on the cutout for the coin door. But whenever I glued this in, when I reinstall it, I won't be using the wood dowels, but the screw that's on either side is what's going to hold this panel in its location. So it's not pinned any longer, but it still fits into a groove. And of course the front side of it was notched the 1/4 inch so that it could slide down in the slot and be in the position on the back side where the factory position was. So my reveal on the front side is a 1/4 inch less. So here's a look at the coin door just pressed into it, and then here's a look at it after it was mounted into the 1/2-inch piece of front panel. Here's a look at the coin door, and one thing you notice there was a switch, normally open, normally closed. I had to reverse mine from what it was. I believe it's going to be normally closed. I think you want that to be normally open, otherwise you're going to get some kind of a coin jam error. Now here's how I set for drilling the side of the cabinet. I've got a piece of plastic that is put on my drill bit, and I set the drill bit so that it doesn't go all the way through. And then of course I drill the hole up till the plastic hits the cab, and now the drill bit can't go in any deeper, and that keeps me from drilling all the way through the cabinet. So then I mount a second board to the cabinet, and that's what I mount the 60-in-1 on. And then you can see the wires that are plugged into the 60-in-1 card. And here's a look at the monitor after it was mounted. And then here we're going to look at a unique feature. What I did was I created a power distribution, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I do have a very detailed picture that shows the schematic. And if you decide to do this, you're going to be doing it at your own risk. I take no responsibility. So I can tell you that whenever I did it, it worked perfect. And it's probably something that might interest you if you're converting and want to use the factory on and off switch. So again, here's that schematic. Study it closely. Make sure you understand it before you do anything. Also, I added the service and test buttons, and also the service button will allow you to put in credits, so you can open the door and press that button and actually put credits on the machine instead of having to dump quarters in there. And I did put a plastic bowl in the bottom and screwed that to the bottom of the cabinet. That way whenever I drop the tin can in, the tin can is always centered underneath the coin drop. Here's a look at that power supply, how it's raised up. And here's a look at that bucket with the tin can inside of it. So if I move the machine around, the tin can is not going to be sliding around. Here's a look at the inside before I closed it up, and after it's closed up you can see that everything is clean, and there is actually a power plug, so if I want to move the machine I can simply unplug the cord and I don't have a cord dangling. You might notice here that the reveal in the front's only 1/4 of an inch now, where it used to be a 1/2 inch. I will be putting a decal on the face that I've created. And there's a look at all of the buttons that I have active, and the service button is not red, but it is also active. Now, one other thing I did was I made a riser for the riser, and you can see here that I epoxied some 2x4s that are cut for a very close fit inside the riser, and I covered the corners with wax paper and taped it in place, so that whenever I put the epoxy on the 2x4s and just set them in place, then I held them with tape, and therefore I did not use any nails to nail these pieces of wood together, because I took it on my table saw and cut out the notch, which allows the cabinet to set down over the 2x4s. So I'm raising it up essentially about 1.5 to 2 inches, which is actually perfect for the sit down play that we do. We use the counter high chairs for play, and you can see here the stock versus the raised up cabinet. So I hope this a little bit of information that I provided you find helpful, and if you have any questions you can just leave them in the comments and I will answer them as best I can.